It was a bright Tuesday morning in Minneapolis. The kind of day where the sun shines just enough to remind you that spring exists, but the lingering chill keeps you firmly tethered to reality. John, a meticulous man with a knack for DIY projects, stood outside his newly purchased home, armed with a toolbox and a brand new smart lock. He was ready to upgrade his gate security, a small but satisfying step toward making this house his home. Little did he know, this seemingly mundane activity was about to catapult him into the starring role of a neighborhood drama so absurd it could have been ripped straight from a satirical sitcom. Across the street, Karen, yes, her name was actually Karen, was perched in her living room window like a hawk monitoring its prey. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the neighbor, the self-appointed guardian of suburban tranquility, HOA rule enforcer, and amateur detective whose qualifications included binge-watching true crime documentaries and owning binoculars she didn't even try to hide. To Karen, John's presence wasn't just new. It was suspicious. A black man fiddling with tools near a gate? Clearly, this wasn't home improvement. It was a crime in progress. Karen squinted harder through her binoculars, her mind racing with possibilities. What is he doing? Breaking in? Tampering with property? Violating HOA regulations? She muttered to herself, clutching her phone like it was her badge of authority. She didn't bother considering that John might actually live there. After all, she hadn't seen him at last month's HOA meeting, where she had passionately argued against decorative lawn flamingos. And in Karen's world, if you weren't at the HOA meeting, you didn't exist. Meanwhile, John was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing across the street. He hummed to himself as he worked, occasionally pausing to admire his progress. The smart lock was sleek and modern, a perfect addition to his gate. He imagined how convenient it would be to unlock it remotely or grant access to friends without fumbling for keys. But as he tightened the final screw, he felt an odd sensation, the distinct feeling of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder and spotted Karen's unmistakable silhouette framed by her lace curtains. Her binoculars glinted ominously in the sunlight. "Great," John muttered under his breath. "I've got my very own neighborhood watch." He shook his head and returned to his work, deciding that Karen's nosiness wasn't worth his energy. Karen, however, had reached her boiling point. "This is unacceptable," she declared to no one in particular before dialing 911 with the urgency of someone reporting an alien invasion. The dispatcher answered calmly, but Karen wasted no time diving into her theatrical monologue. "There's a man outside tampering with a gate. I think he's trying to break in. Or worse, he looks suspicious," Karen emphasized dramatically, as though suspicious were a legally actionable offense. The dispatcher asked for more details. Was anyone in danger? Was there evidence of criminal activity? Karen faltered for a moment but quickly recovered. "Well, not yet, but isn't it better to be safe than sorry? You know how these things escalate." She didn't elaborate on what these things were, but felt confident that her tone conveyed enough urgency. Within minutes, 2 squad cars rolled up to John's house, lights flashing but sirens mercifully silent. John froze mid-screwdriver twist as officers stepped out and approached him cautiously. "Sir," one officer began, "we received a call about suspicious activity involving this gate." John blinked in disbelief before gesturing toward his toolbox and the smart lock he'd just installed. "Suspicious activity? I'm installing a lock on my own gate." The officer glanced at Karen's house, where she was now standing on her porch with arms crossed and an expression that screamed, "I told you so." "Do you have proof that this is your property?" the officer asked. John sighed deeply, a sigh filled with equal parts frustration and exhaustion, and pulled out his phone to show them the deed to his house. "Here," he said flatly. "I bought this place 2 months ago." The officers examined the document before nodding in acknowledgement. "All right," one said apologetically. "Looks like everything checks out." Karen wasn't satisfied. She marched over like she was auditioning for Law and Order. "HOA unit. Wait, what about the HOA rules?" she demanded. "You can't just install things without approval. This could be against regulations." John raised an eyebrow at her audacity. "Karen, he said slowly, savoring every syllable of her name like it was an insult disguised as politeness. "This lock is for security, something I'm pretty sure isn't prohibited by your precious HOA." Karen sputtered incoherently before pivoting back to the officers. "Well, aren't you going to do something?" He could be lying. The officers exchanged weary glances before one replied diplomatically, "Ma'am, we've verified that he owns this property and hasn't committed any crimes." Karen opened her mouth to protest but closed it when she realized she had no further ammunition. She retreated back to her porch in defeat but continued glaring at John as though sheer disapproval could undo his work. John watched her retreat with a smirk before turning back to the officers. "Thanks for clearing that up," he said dryly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a lock to finish installing." As the squad cars drove away and peace returned to the neighborhood, at least temporarily, John couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. He looked down at his smart lock, the source of so much unnecessary drama, and decided it deserved an upgrade of its own. Maybe a sign that read "Installed by owner." No need for binoculars or 911 calls. Karen might have won minor battles in HOA meetings past, but today belonged to John and his perfectly secure gate. John barely had time to finish tightening the last screw on his shiny new smart lock before Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac, sprang into action. To her, John's calm demeanor and focused work were nothing short of suspicious activity. After all, who installs a lock on their gate without first submitting a 12-page proposal to the HOA's Architectural Review Committee? Karen was certain she had stumbled upon a nefarious plot, a crime so heinous it could only be thwarted by her trusty phone and an overzealous 911 call. As Karen marched back and forth in her living room, phone in hand, she rehearsed her lines like an actress preparing for an Oscar-worthy performance. "Yes, officer. He's tampering with the gate. It's highly suspicious. No, I don't know his name. He just doesn't belong here." She emphasized the last part with dramatic flair, as though she were auditioning for a role in a police procedural drama. Her binoculars sat nearby on the coffee table, ready for action should she need additional evidence. Meanwhile, John was still blissfully unaware of the chaos brewing across the street. He admired his handiwork, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. The smart lock gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of progress and security. He imagined how convenient it would be to unlock the gate remotely when friends visited or when he needed to let in delivery drivers. But as he stepped back to admire his work, he noticed something peculiar. Karen's silhouette in her window, binoculars raised like a sniper targeting an enemy combatant. John sighed deeply. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath. He had heard about people like Karen, neighbors who treated HOA guidelines as sacred texts and viewed every deviation from suburban conformity as an existential threat. Still, he figured she'd eventually lose interest and move on to her next crusade, perhaps against someone whose mailbox was one shade too beige. But Karen was relentless. She dialed 911 with the urgency of someone reporting an alien invasion. "Hello? Yes, I need police assistance immediately," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured panic. "There's a man outside tampering with a gate. He looks suspicious. I think he might be breaking in." The dispatcher on the other end tried to clarify. "Ma'am, is anyone in immediate danger? Has this person threatened you or anyone else?" Karen faltered for a moment but quickly recovered. "Well, no, not yet. But isn't it better to act before something bad happens? Prevention is key." She delivered this line with the confidence of someone who had just read about crime prevention in a neighborhood watch pamphlet. The dispatcher sighed audibly but decided not to argue. "All right, ma'am. We'll send officers to check it out." Karen hung up triumphantly and returned to her window perch, binoculars at the ready. She watched as 2 squad cars pulled up to John's house, lights flashing but sirens mercifully silent. She felt vindicated. Surely now everyone would see her as the hero of this story. John froze as the officers approached him cautiously. One of them spoke first. "Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity involving this gate." John blinked in disbelief before gesturing toward his toolbox and the smart lock he had just installed. "Suspicious activity?" I'm installing a lock on my own gate. The officer glanced at Karen's house, where she was now standing on her porch with arms crossed and an expression that screamed, "I told you so." "Do you have proof that this is your property?" the officer asked. John sighed again, this time louder, and pulled out his phone to show them the deed to his house. "Here," he said flatly. "I bought this place 2 months ago." The officers examined the document before nodding in acknowledgement. "All right," one said apologetically. "Looks like everything checks out." But Karen wasn't done yet. She marched over like she was leading a protest against decorative lawn flamingos at an HOA meeting. "Wait, what about the HOA rules?" she demanded. "You can't just install things without approval. This could be against regulations." John raised an eyebrow at her audacity. "Karen," he said slowly, savoring every syllable of her name like it was an insult disguised as politeness. "This lock is for security, something I'm pretty sure isn't prohibited by your precious HOA." Karen sputtered incoherently before pivoting back to the officers. "Well, aren't you going to do something?" He could be lying. The officers exchanged weary glances before one replied diplomatically, "Ma'am, we verified that he owns this property and hasn't committed any crimes." Karen opened her mouth to protest but closed it when she realized she had no further ammunition. She retreated back to her porch in defeat but continued glaring at John as though sheer disapproval could undo his work. John watched her retreat with a smirk before turning back to the officers. "Thanks for clearing that up," he said dryly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a lock to finish installing." As John resumed his work on the gate, Karen sulked on her porch, muttering under her breath about how nobody respected HOA rules anymore. She considered filing an official complaint with the Architectural Review Committee but decided against it. After all, they hadn't even backed her campaign against solar panels last year. Across the street, another neighbor peered out from behind their curtains and chuckled quietly to themselves. They'd seen Karen pull stunts like this before, calling 911 because someone parked too close to their driveway or reporting kids for riding bikes without helmets. But this incident was particularly ridiculous. By the time John finished installing his smart lock, peace had mostly returned to the neighborhood, except for Karen's simmering resentment. He stepped back to admire his work one last time and couldn't help but laugh at how much drama such a simple task had caused. "Well," he thought aloud, "if nothing else, this neighborhood is going to be interesting." John had hoped that the police intervention would mark the end of Karen's antics, but he underestimated her commitment to being the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer of all things petty. For Karen, this wasn't just about a gate or a lock, it was about principle. And by principle, she meant her unwavering belief that her interpretation of the HOA guidelines was the only one that mattered. If John thought he could outsmart her with his fancy lock and legal paperwork, he was sorely mistaken. Karen wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She retreated to her living room, where she kept a meticulously organized binder labeled HOA Regulations, 2025 edition. It was filled with color-coded tabs, handwritten notes in the margins, and printouts of emails she'd sent to the HOA board over the years. She flipped through the pages like a lawyer preparing for trial, searching for anything she could use against John. "Aha!" she exclaimed, triumphantly stabbing her finger at a section titled Exterior Modifications. Any changes to the exterior of a property must be submitted for approval to the Architectural Review Committee. She read it aloud twice, savoring each word as though it were poetry. Never mind that this rule was intended for major renovations like adding a deck or painting your house neon green. Karen decided it applied to smart locks, too. Armed with her newfound ammunition, Karen marched back outside and called over to John, who was now sweeping up sawdust from his earlier work. "Excuse me," she shouted, her voice dripping with indignation. "I have reviewed the HOA regulations, and you are in clear violation of Section 4.2 regarding exterior modifications." John looked up from his broom, visibly unimpressed. "Karen," he said, "it's a lock, not a gazebo." Karen ignored his sarcasm and continued her tirade. "You were supposed to submit an application to the Architectural Review Committee. Did you even bother to check the guidelines before installing that thing?" John leaned on his broom and sighed deeply. Karen, I'm pretty sure the HOA isn't going to care about my lock. Oh, they'll care, Karen snapped. I'm going to make sure they care. True to her word, Karen spent the next hour drafting an email to the HOA board. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive rhetoric, complete with phrases like, as a concerned resident, and to preserve the integrity of our community. She attached photos of John's gate taken from various angles, using her binoculars for zoom, along with an annotated copy of the regulations highlighting section 4.2 in bright yellow. When she hit send, Karen felt victorious. Surely, the HOA would see things her way and force John to remove his lock, or at least reprimand him for his blatant disregard of protocol. Meanwhile, John decided he'd had enough of Karen's nonsense. He wasn't usually one for confrontation, but this situation called for drastic measures. He pulled out his laptop and began researching HOA rules himself. Not because he doubted his compliance, but because he wanted to beat Karen at her own game. It didn't take long for John to uncover some interesting information about Karen's own property. Apparently, she had violated multiple HOA guidelines over the years. Her backyard shed exceeded height restrictions by 3 feet. Her fence was painted an unauthorized shade of eggshell white, and she had installed solar panels without submitting an application, a fact that had caused quite a stir at last year's HOA meeting. Armed with this knowledge, John decided it was time for some poetic justice. The next day, John showed up at Karen's house holding a clipboard and wearing a smile that could only be described as mischievous. Karen opened her door reluctantly, eyeing him with suspicion. "Good morning," John said cheerfully. "I'm conducting a survey on behalf of concerned residents regarding compliance with HOA guidelines." Karen frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Well," John continued, flipping through pages on his clipboard, "I couldn't help but notice your backyard shed seems taller than regulation allows." Karen stiffened. "That shed has been there for years. No one's ever complained about it before." John nodded sympathetically. "Oh, I understand. Mistakes happen, but rules are rules, right? We wouldn't want anyone undermining the integrity of our community." Karen glared at him but said nothing. "And your fence," John added casually. "It's lovely, but isn't it supposed to be painted classic white instead of eggshell? I mean, I could be wrong, but I doubt it." Karen crossed her arms defensively. "Eggshell is close enough." John raised an eyebrow. "Close enough? Interesting interpretation. I wonder if the Architectural Review Committee would agree." Karen opened her mouth to respond but quickly shut it when she realized she had no defense. "Oh!" John exclaimed suddenly as though he'd just remembered something important. "Your solar panels. They're great for the environment, but didn't you forget to submit an application before installing them?" Karen's face turned redder than a stop sign. "I'm sure it was just an oversight," John said with mock sincerity. "But you know how strict the HOA can be about these things." Karen stared at him in silence for what felt like an eternity before slamming her door shut without another word. John walked away feeling victorious, not because he wanted revenge, okay, maybe just a little, but because he knew Karen would think twice before meddling in his business again. Later that week, Karen received an email from the HOA board informing her that multiple residents had raised concerns about her property's non-compliance with regulations. She spent hours drafting defensive responses but ultimately decided against sending them. After all, she didn't want to draw more attention to herself. As for John, he installed another smart lock on his garage door, this time without incident, and enjoyed watching Karen avoid eye contact whenever their paths crossed. In the end, suburban life returned to its usual rhythm. Lawn mowers buzzing in unison, kids playing tag on driveways, and Karen quietly sulking behind her lace curtains while John whistled happily as he worked on his next project. A mailbox upgrade that would surely give her something new to obsess over. John had spent the last few days basking in the quiet satisfaction of his small victory over Karen. His smart lock gleamed proudly on the gate, a symbol of defiance against suburban tyranny. But Karen wasn't done. Oh no, Karen wasn't the type to let something as trivial as logic or HOA guidelines stop her crusade. She had spent the better part of the week poring over her binder of HOA rules, hunting for any clause, subclause, or footnote that could be weaponized against John. If HOA bylaws were scripture, Karen was their most zealous prophet. On Friday morning, John woke up to find an envelope taped to his front door. It was stamped with the official HOA logo and addressed to him in bold, accusatory font. Inside was a letter signed by none other than Karen herself, acting in her unofficial capacity as Neighborhood Compliance Liaison. The letter accused John of violating Section 4.2 of the HOA guidelines regarding exterior modifications and demanded that he remove the smart lock immediately or face further action. John read the letter twice, then laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Further action? He muttered to himself. What's she going to do? Sue me for locking my own gate? He tossed the letter onto the kitchen counter and decided it was time to escalate things. Not with anger, but with creativity. Later that afternoon, John paid a visit to the local hardware store and returned home with a bag full of supplies. He spent hours tinkering in his garage, crafting what could only be described as a masterpiece of passive-aggressive engineering. By sunset, he had installed a second lock on his gate, a comically oversized padlock painted bright pink with glitter accents. Beneath it, he attached a sign that read, "For Karen, HOA compliant lock number 2. The next morning, Karen stormed out of her house like a woman possessed. She marched straight to John's gate and stared at the pink monstrosity in horror. Her face twisted into an expression that could curdle milk. "What is this?" she shrieked. John appeared in his driveway holding a cup of coffee and wearing a grin that rivaled the Cheshire Cat's. "Good morning, Karen," he called cheerfully. "I noticed your concern about my original lock, so I added another one, just for you." Karen sputtered incoherently for a moment before regaining her composure. "This is ridiculous. You can't just install whatever you want." "Oh, but I can," John replied smugly. "I checked the HOA guidelines thoroughly. There's no rule against decorative locks." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red as she pointed at the sign beneath the lock. "That sign is harassment. I'm reporting you to the HOA board." "Feel free," John said with a shrug. "I'm sure they'll love hearing about your dedication to community aesthetics." Karen stormed off in a huff, muttering threats under her breath about fines and legal action. But John wasn't done yet. Over the next week, he transformed his front yard into a satirical homage to HOA absurdity. He installed miniature flamingos wearing sunglasses, a nod to Karen's infamous anti-flamingo campaign, planted bushes trimmed into question marks, symbolizing confusion over HOA rules, and added solar-powered lights shaped like tiny surveillance cameras, all aimed directly at Karen's house. The neighborhood quickly took notice. Residents began stopping by to admire John's handiwork and share their own grievances about Karen's antics. One neighbor confessed she'd been fined for planting daisies instead of tulips. Another revealed he'd been reprimanded for having a mailbox that was slightly taller than regulation height. Karen, meanwhile, was losing her grip on authority. Her complaints to the HOA board fell on deaf ears. They were tired of her constant nitpicking and had started ignoring her emails altogether. But then came the twist no one saw coming. One evening, John received an unexpected phone call from an HOA board member named Susan, a pragmatic woman who had long been skeptical of Karen's self-appointed role as neighborhood enforcer. "John," Susan began cautiously, "I've been reviewing some old records, and it seems Karen herself has been violating multiple HOA guidelines for years." John nearly dropped his phone in shock but quickly recovered. "You don't say," he replied with mock surprise. Susan went on to explain that Karen's backyard shed exceeded height restrictions by several feet. Her fence was painted an unauthorized color, and her solar panels had been installed without proper approval. A trifecta of hypocrisy so delicious it could have been served as dessert. "I thought you might want to know," Susan concluded with a chuckle. John thanked her profusely and hung up feeling like he'd just won the lottery. The next day, armed with this newfound information, John printed copies of Karen's violations and distributed them anonymously throughout the neighborhood, complete with photos taken from public vantage points. Because unlike Karen, John respected privacy. By evening, Karen's reputation as the neighborhood watchdog had crumbled entirely. Residents began openly mocking her hypocrisy. Some even added their own decorative touches to their yards in solidarity with John's rebellion. Karen retreated into her house like a defeated dictator, refusing to make eye contact with anyone who passed by. As for John, he celebrated his victory by hosting a barbecue in his newly decorated yard, complete with flamingo-themed napkins and glittery pink balloons tied to his oversized padlock. Neighbors came in droves, laughing and sharing stories about their own run-ins with Karen's overzealous enforcement tactics. By the end of the night, one thing was clear. Suburban life might be governed by rules and regulations, but sometimes all it takes is a little creativity and a lot of glitter to remind everyone what really matters. Community, laughter, and standing up to bullies disguised as rule followers. John's barbecue had been the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. The pink flamingos, the glittery balloons, and the oversized padlock had become symbols of rebellion against suburban tyranny. Karen, meanwhile, had gone radio silent, a rare and beautiful phenomenon that many neighbors hoped would last forever. But John knew better. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat so easily. She was likely plotting her next move, perhaps drafting a 50-page manifesto on why flamingos were a threat to property values. Sure enough, Karen re-emerged one morning with a clipboard in hand and a determined glint in her eye. She had decided to take her grievances door to door, rallying support for what she called Operation Restore Order. Her plan was simple: convince the HOA to pass stricter regulations that would outlaw anything she deemed unsightly. Naturally, this included John's flamingos, his glittery lock, and probably his entire existence. Karen's first stop was the house of Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood since the Reagan administration. Karen knocked on her door with the enthusiasm of a Girl Scout selling cookies. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Karen chirped. "I'm collecting signatures for a petition to improve our neighborhood standards." Mrs. Thompson squinted at Karen through her thick glasses. "What standards?" "Well," Karen began, flipping through her clipboard, "there have been some questionable changes around here lately. For example, those garish flamingos at John's house." "Oh, I love those flamingos," Mrs. Thompson interrupted with a smile. "They remind me of my trip to Florida in '92. Karen's eye twitched. "Yes, but they're not exactly tasteful." Mrs. Thompson shrugged. "Taste is subjective, dear." Karen left Mrs. Thompson's house empty-handed and visibly irritated. Her next stop was the Johnsons' house, a young couple who had recently moved in with their 2 golden retrievers. Surely they would understand the importance of maintaining order. "Hi there," Karen said brightly when Mrs. Johnson answered the door. "I'm gathering signatures to address some concerns about neighborhood aesthetics." Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Aesthetics?" "Yes," Karen replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Have you seen John's yard? It's practically a circus." Mrs. Johnson laughed. "Oh, we love John. He gave us a spare key to his gate so we could let our dogs play in his yard." Karen blinked in disbelief. "You what?" "Yeah," Mrs. Johnson said cheerfully. "He even put up one of those smart locks on his garage for us to use if we ever need tools." Karen's clipboard trembled in her hands as she realized her campaign was doomed before it even began. Meanwhile, John was blissfully unaware of Karen's latest scheme, or rather, he didn't care enough to pay attention. He was busy planning his next project, a custom mailbox shaped like a flamingo wearing sunglasses, because why not? He figured if Karen was going to hate him anyway, he might as well give her something worth hating. The mailbox arrived a week later, and John installed it with great fanfare. Neighbors gathered to watch as he unveiled his masterpiece. A pink flamingo with outstretched wings and a mail slot cleverly disguised as its beak. "It's beautiful," Mrs. Johnson said, snapping pictures with her phone. "Iconic," added Mr. Patel from down the street. Karen watched from her window, seething with rage. She couldn't believe how quickly the neighborhood had turned against her, or worse, rallied behind John and his ridiculous antics. But then came the final blow. One afternoon, an official-looking envelope arrived in Karen's mailbox bearing the HOA logo. She tore it open eagerly, hoping it contained news of John's imminent punishment for his many transgressions. Instead, It was a notice informing her that she was being fined for multiple violations of HOA guidelines, including her oversized shed, unauthorized fence color, and unapproved solar panels. Karen stared at the letter in horror as realization dawned. Susan from the HOA board must have finally acted on all those complaints John had subtly encouraged his neighbors to file against her. Desperate to salvage what remained of her reputation, Karen stormed into the next HOA meeting armed with charts, graphs, and an impassioned speech about why John was ruining the neighborhood. "His flamingos are an eyesore," she declared dramatically. "His glittery lock is a mockery of our standards, and that mailbox. It's an affront to everything this community stands for." The room fell silent for a moment before Susan spoke up from her seat at the head of the table. "Karen," Susan said calmly, "we've received more complaints about your property than anyone else's in this neighborhood." Karen opened her mouth to protest but was cut off by Mr. Patel. "Honestly," he said with a shrug, "I think John's flamingos are great. They bring some personality to this place. And his lock is hilarious," added Mrs. Johnson. Even Mrs. Thompson chimed in. "That mailbox is delightful. It makes me smile every time I see it." Karen looked around the room in disbelief as one by one, her neighbors voiced their support for John and his whimsical approach to suburban living. Defeated and humiliated, Karen slumped back into her chair and muttered something about moving to a gated community where people appreciated rules. As for John, he left the meeting feeling like a hero, and not just because he'd won over his neighbors. He'd proven that sometimes all it takes to stand up to bullies is a little creativity, and maybe some pink glitter. The next day, John added another sign to his gate beneath the oversized padlock. "Welcome to Flamingo Lane, where fun lives rent free." And from that day forward, life in the neighborhood was just a little brighter, except for Karen's house, where all the curtains remained firmly closed. If you enjoyed this story about suburban chaos and glitter-fueled revenge, don't forget to like this video. Share it with your friends who've dealt with their own Karens. We all know one. Leave a comment below telling us your favorite part of John's epic takedown. And hey, subscribe for more stories that'll make you laugh out loud while rooting for justice. Thanks for watching.